How is it possible that unsafe wireless technologies are being sold to the public and handed to children like candy? We uncover the truth with this top EMF scientist. You're listening to the 2025 EMF HAZARD Summit. My name is Nick, the EMF guy Pinot, and this is the EMF HAZARD Summit, Protect Your Children. In this presentation, Dr. Paul Héroux reveals the sobering truth behind our so-called EMF safety standards and how science clearly shows that the current levels of EMF exposures are linked with cancer, mitochondrial dysfunction, and can even increase your risks of diabetes and blood sugar disorders. Dr. Paul Héroux is a physicist and toxicologist with 15 years of experience in electrical engineering and 35 years in the health sciences. After rounding out his formation with courses in biology and medicine, he became interested in health problems connected with electromagnetism. He is currently a commissioner to the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, also called the ICBE-EMF group. I'm here today with Dr. Paul Héroux. Dr. Héroux, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
A fellow French-Canadian, it is to me a big surprise each time I tell people about your work. Of course, my friends here in Quebec say, well, no, I never heard about Dr. Paul Héroux. He's an international, expert on EMFs, and he's studying here at McGill. They are not aware. So, I know that you've been all around the world in EMF conferences and collaborating with many EMF scientists. Can you tell people very quickly about your scientific background, and then what have you found around the impact that human-made EMFs like Wi-Fi or cell phone radiation can have on human cells?
Well, my background is that I was originally trained as a physicist. But while I was doing research for Hydro-Québec Institute of Research, which is a power utility, they have a separate research institute, I was tasked with looking into the problem of biological effects of electromagnetic radiation. And eventually, on the occasion of an epidemiological project with McGill University, I sort of defected to McGill University, where I am presently, and I teach there health effects of electromagnetism and hearing conservation and principles of toxicology. That is my background.
Great. And what have you found when it comes to the effects that human-made EMFs, such as Wi-Fi or cell phone radiation, can have on humans, right? Adults and children, or on any biology for that matter?
Well, the interesting thing is that, as you know, various industries are always very eager to, I would say, protect their interests by minimizing the impacts of the agents that they produce or that they use and so on. And I think the telecommunications and power industry are not different. They basically told the public, don't worry about magnetic fields or radio frequency fields because they are non-ionizing. Furthermore, they are much too weak to affect you because they don't heat tissues that much, which meant that in their minds that, well, they can't compete with the thermal energy of, say, water molecules in your body. And so they have used these arguments for decades, if not at least a century in some cases, to give the impression that there was nothing to worry about. And they use these arguments with people, with governments, with agencies, and they got quite a lot of mileage from these, I would say, these lies, unfortunately. Because if you really look at it even a little more closely, one of the things that you see immediately is that the fact that it's non-ionizing radiation is completely irrelevant because your body is already ionized. So you are a very, very active being in terms of chemical activity. Furthermore, your vital existence, the fact that you are alive, depends on billions and billions of tiny currents that circulate inside your cells. Without these currents, you would be exactly like a rock. You would be very, very different from a living being. And so these small currents are extremely vulnerable to any electromagnetic field, either ELF or RF, that comes from the outside. And this is inevitable. As long as you have currents driving life, life will be very sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. The last aspect is that in the body, you have reactive oxygen species, which are charged atoms, which are very, very biologically important. And the fact that you are alive has the effect that you encourage a minimum amount of these reactive oxygen species in your body. So these three elements, your body is ionized, you're full of tiny currents, and by the way, including protonic currents, with which engineers are totally unfamiliar, as well as reactive oxygen species, sets the perfect table for environmental electromagnetic fields to have effects on people. So the very basic effect is an effect on the electron transport chain, as well as the proton gradient that is maintained inside mitochondria in every one of our cells. So this is the very, very basic phenomenon. But of course, downstream, there are all sorts of other things that will happen. In other words, if you have an unstable supply of ATP in your cells, that encourages things like cancer, that encourages things like chronic diseases such as diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's, and so on. So the truth is that we have been living with the consequences of these exposures for decades, if not a century. And so it's not that this radiation is such a novelty that we are not familiar with its consequences. We have been living with its consequences for a very long time. On the other hand, you're very aware that in the radio frequency spectrum, we are adding stimuli, or so to speak, newcomers all the time with 5G and 6G, and the enthusiasm of industry to create new aggressors seems to be completely, they're completely undeterred. Whatever the scientific literature says about, yes, you have more glioblastoma, yes, you have more acoustic neuroma, yes, children experience more leukemia, they don't care. They don't want to hear it. They have this internal culture which allows them to believe fantasies, which is that, don't worry, people are not affected by electromagnetic fields. And I am very, very, very chagrined I was trained as a physicist, and I feel that physics was completely perverted by people who were essentially hired by industry to mislead populations who did not have training in physics.
And do you feel like the missing link is biophysics in a sense? Because I feel like people, at least I get on with, I don't know if that's a good reflection of the human knowledge, but I argue online on social media sometimes, and some people say, you know, I have a background on physics, and this is non-ionizing radiation. And I tell them, well, what about, you know, the biophysics, the physics of the cell, and the fact that there are, for example, ion channels on the cells that could be disrupted? And usually they have nothing to say. It looks like they haven't even studied the question, and yet they they have this hubris, this arrogance that, oh, I know everything about the biological of EMFs, but they spent 0 seconds studying the biophysics. Why isn't that more known?
You're entirely right, Nick. It's a question of segmentation of knowledge. In fact, biologists can barely converse with biochemists. In other words, knowledge is sliced in such tiny areas, hyper specialization, that people know very, very little about, neighboring sciences. We have passed the time in human history where humanism, which is the integration of knowledge, was valued. Now it's specialization, and essentially you're hired by a corporation to protect and to advance a product, and you are supposed to know nothing else. This is almost considered a virtue. And so we are guilty. I mean, look at universities. They are divided in lots and lots of departments that teach very, very different things. And interdisciplinary thinking, although it is mentioned often, it is very, very rarely done.
With the group ICBE-EMF, you have looked at the safety standards that we still use in most countries around the world, if not all. What was the conclusion that you and other scientists came to when it comes to our safety regulations? Are they sufficient to protect the public, including children, from damage or health risks associated with our modern technologies?
You know, we looked at that relatively closely. The process of developing these standards, and I feel very guilty because I was around in the years when these things were developed. But at the time, I was too young to realize exactly what was happening. I thought, my bosses must be taking care of all of this, right? And so you don't have the, I would say, the initiative or the assurance to protest what is happening. Mm-hmm. But what actually happened is that industry was really embarrassed by this biophysical problem. They didn't really know how to handle it. They used their own thinking, their own knowledge in order to solve a problem that they knew too little about. And so they based their standards on the opinions of individuals who had developed microwave ovens, who were actually engineering, people. And these individuals essentially use extremely flimsy results, experimental results, to confirm the thing that they wanted all along, that these fields were not dangerous. We're talking about tests that were run over less than an hour on a small number of rats and a small number of monkeys, and using only practically one performance test. And what these military investigators were worried about is, will that affect the decision-making of a pilot in an F-16 fighter? This is what they were concerned about. But when the industry saw these reports, they thought, well, why can't we use these short-term tests to arrive at long-term conclusions and general conclusions about toxicity, which is completely inappropriate. And how did they achieve this? It's by pushing out people who tried to warn them, like Dr. David Carpenter and many others, biologists or public health people who wanted a more complete assessment to be performed. But of course, it wasn't in the interest of industry to do this, because what they saw very clearly is the commercial prospects associated with the use of wireless radiation in particular, and of course, as well, electrification of society.
So what kind of scientific indication do we have that handing a child a tablet for several hours per day is safe? Do we have any idea of what it's doing to them?
We have many results from animal models because, as you know, we cannot experiment on a group of controlled children and exposed children and then autopsy their brains. That's not very ethical, is it?
Yeah.
So these types of investigations are done on rats, and people have determined that even below threshold levels of heat, we have observed that there are anatomical differences in the rats that have been exposed to radiation. And perhaps the most telling piece of data is that I have been in contact with many teachers who have witnessed the introduction of Wi-Fi in schools. And these teachers are telling me that since Wi-Fi was introduced, they have more problems with attention and with mental performance than before. However, you know, if I subtract 10 IQ points from you right now, snapping my fingers, you probably won't feel anything. And so the problem is that indeed we modify our environment. This environment is filled with electromagnetic radiation that interacts heavily with the brain simply because the brain depends very, very significantly on the supply of ATP. And ATP is disturbed by electromagnetic fields. So your brain is disturbed, its performance is impaired, but we're not very, very good at assessing this in real time. In other words, you put your phone against your head, you may lose a few IQ points right at that moment, but there's no way for you to tell. The brain has very poor, I would say, means of assessing its own performance.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I know that as an engineer, you also wrote a paper about how the industry could lower the amount of radiation that is emitted by many devices. That paper, I think, was brilliant, talking about engineering solutions. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I feel like a lot of people in the public are looking for safer devices, are looking for lower radiation alternatives in the market. And I feel like the work that you've done on that end can give a little bit of hope or a little bit of inspiration maybe to engineers watching this, that there is a safer way to engineer things to at least start moving in the right direction.
You know, when people like at ICBE challenge industry, the reaction that we usually get from, say, the power industry, then we'll let you freeze in the dark if you don't accept our view. And the telecommunications industry is that we'll remove your cell phones and your internet. Ha, ha, ha. So they tend to focus on the benefits of these advances in technology. And we don't deny these advances, but what we are saying, there are ways to, in essence, do technology better that is more respectful of human physiology. So we're not going to eliminate power systems. We're not going to eliminate telecommunications. But in relation to telecommunications, we would favor optical fiber, which is incomparably more powerful than wireless, and we would use wireless only when necessary. And in fact, in many enclosed spaces, you can easily use Li-Fi instead of Wi-Fi. In other words, use frequencies of light to which human beings are adapted, because we have lived under the sun for a very long time, if I'm not mistaken, whereas radio frequency radiation is entirely new. So there is no reason to believe that we would have natural resistance to this radiation, whereas there is reason to believe that we would be fairly resistant to infrared radiation. So behave smartly. Don't use advancing technology to shoot yourself in the foot. And indeed, we have talked in this article about many techniques. Some are hardware-based. In other words, you would need to make the phones differently. Some are software-based. your phone can help you reduce your exposure. And so these two things together would allow us as consumers to have our cake and eat it too.
It makes me think about an interview you gave to Epoch Times several months ago. You talked specifically about the fact that certain frequencies seem to be more harmful than others. And it really made me very interested in that possibility that I wanted to ask you personally, do you think it could be possible to even explore ways to make wireless safer, the current wireless that we use? And that's a personal curiosity, but I know that a lot of people listening to the summit would have the same question as well.
Of course, it's possible. In other words, if you have a good Fourier transform program and you can really analyze things, what you have to understand is that both radio frequencies, continuous radio frequencies, and ELF frequencies have biological impacts. But it seems that the ELF frequencies have more impact than the RF. So you have to do more sophisticated experiments to detect the effects of continuous RF radiation. But when you start modulating RF radiation, you introduce ELF components that are more bioactive. So by studying this problem in detail, I'm sure I could design systems for radio frequency Wi-Fi that are less, I would say, deleterious to physiology. But you do that theoretically, then you have to demonstrate it experimentally, and you have to make industry believe that it's worthwhile to introduce it into their devices. And we're a little bit far from that right now. They're even resistant to making the antennas in their cell phones directional in order to diffuse less of the energy into the head rather than into the telecommunication systems. So I don't think industry is there yet, but scientifically, you're right, it is possible.
This is great. This is exactly my personal assessment, but hearing it from you is a great confirmation also. The last thing I wanted to address, I know that you talked a little bit about that in the past. You said, you told me that you have been trying to get an article published on EMFs, and it's a link with metabolism. I know that in previous interviews, you even talked about the fact that our use of wireless could be one of the culprits explaining why the obesity rates have been increasing. This is something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate in this world that is very focused on food and the amount of food that we eat. Why did you come to this conclusion that somehow our use of wireless could impact blood sugar or metabolism?
Well, when I was doing experiments on human cells at the Royal Victoria Hospital, I began to appreciate that ELF magnetic fields, which are also contained in telecommunication signal, have a strong impact on metabolism. So in other words, you have metabolism that consumes glucose, and you transform that into ATP. If you dysregulate this process, well, one of the things you're going to do, you're going to diverge some of the energy that you would otherwise have as ATP into fats. In other words, you will not consume the fats, or you will use ATP to produce more fats. But dysregulation of basic metabolism is a risk factor for certainly diabetes. And even at that point, that's many years ago, my thought was, will American women forgive industry for making them fat? Which is probably a more powerful statement than anything else in public health.
So how can this impact children then? The effects are likely worse on children's metabolism and diabetes risks or blood sugar regulation. And we know that all of these, that's speculation on my part right now, because I don't think we have many. Is there even scientific studies that have looked at this link that have been published yet? at all?
Well, the studies are very, very basic, so the consequences are not really appreciated. In public health, there's always many factors that impact a given disease. For example, you have fat children. Well, they are sitting in front of computers because they are being entertained by, creative animations that capture their attention. So that is certainly an important factor. But the environment in which they work, they work and play is also a factor. And the fact that there are multiple causes doesn't mean that you should tolerate or disregard the electromagnetic environment. I am convinced that the electromagnetic environment has a role to play. And sometimes I meet with sports coaches who tell me, it seems that the new generation is less inclined to physical activity. And of course, you can explain this in so many ways, sociological, visualization of screens and so on. But I believe that the electromagnetic environment is part of it.
One thing that blew my mind as a closing remark is, I don't know if that's accurate, and you're going to correct me on this if I'm not. It looks like in laboratory settings, scientists are using microwave radiation to induce a diabetes-like condition in rats or mice. Is this correct? And does this mean anything about this potential link between EMFs and blood sugar regulation or diabetes?
So you're right, it is done. And of course, in these experiments, they use rather high exposures.
Okay.
So exactly how it relates to the subtle long-term exposures that every one of us are exposed to is not obvious, but I believe there is a connection. I believe there is a physiological connection between electromagnetic field exposures and diabetes.
Thank you. And I'm very, very grateful for your work. I know that many people will be too. Is there any way that we can follow or support your work? I know you're associated with many organizations. There's the ICBE group that I mentioned. There's going to be a link near the video. Is there any other way that we can follow or support your work?
Well, ICBE really is a focus of my concerns right now. I think that this organization is going somewhere, and I am supporting it very, very heartily. So at the moment, I only have very modest experimental capabilities in my lab because, as you know, there is no funding for research on electromagnetic radiation in North America. All the work is being done abroad, basically, because it seems to be a taboo here. Past the National Toxicology Program, it seems that we have heard crickets, silence essentially in this area. So unfortunately, the present society is not enthusiastic about doing further experimental work.
At least on a governmental level, for sure. I agree with you. So I'm very glad that you are getting involved, or you got involved with the ICBE. I think that what that group has published, in my view as an activist, I've been doing this for 8 years now. I think it has been some of the most impactful work by scientists, and a good rebuke to very bad and biased science that has been published by other scientists that I think are influenced by industry. So I want to commend you for doing this work, and I'm very, very grateful for your time and for sharing your expertise here on the EMF hazards.
And your assessment is very, very accurate. Congratulations on your thinking.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I really hope that you liked this presentation. If you want to take action on what you just heard, you'll find links to everything that was mentioned by our guest speaker right underneath this interview. If you love the summit and want to own the recordings in audio, video, and written form for all of these 2025 interviews, make sure to click the buttons on this page to get the 2025 EMF pack. This EMF pack is heavily discounted during the summit launch and for a very limited time. Remember that every purchase supports my work as an independent citizen journalist, as well as the nonprofit partners that are associated with this summit. Thank you for your attention and support, and I'll see you in the next presentation.